Yes, you should definitely read this, and I'm going to tell you why. In this video, I'm going to cover some of the basic info about this book, like the structure of the book itself, what prerequisites you need before diving into this, as well as the fictional setting. And after that, I'm going to give you some of my reasons for why I think you should read this. Now, on to the structure of this book. One thing you need to know is that this isn't actually one single novel. This is actually three separate short stories contained within one single volume. So there are three stories that come with this, and the first story is called The Hedge Knight, and then you have The Sworn Sword, and then you also have The Mystery Knight. So those are the names of the three stories contained within, and each story is about 120 pages long. So you see that each story isn't actually that long, and for this particular edition, you'll see that it comes with a ton of really nice illustrations throughout the story. So I'd say each story is actually a little bit less than 120 pages, so it's actually quite short and accessible, and that'll be the overall structure of this book. On to the prerequisites, I personally think all you need to know is just some basic understanding of Westeros and the Game of Thrones universe. You might be wondering whether you need to have read all the original novels before you can dive into this. It certainly is one of those cases where the more background and lore you know, the better, but the short stories themselves are actually quite self contained, so I think even if you've only watched the shows, you can dive straight into this because you'll already have a good understanding of Westeros and how things work in that universe, like all the names of the great houses and who the Targaryens are and what King's Landing is. One thing you might be confused by is the timeline and how these stories fit into the wider narrative of the Song and Ice and Fire universe, and that's what we'll be talking about next. On to the timeline and setting of this novel, one thing you need to understand is George R. R. Martin is absolutely crazy in a good way, and he's basically fleshed out the entire history of the Targaryen dynasty. You might have also heard of Fire and Blood, where he's written down the full details of the history of the first half of the Targaryen dynasty. So this brings us to the important question of how these stories fit into this wider timeline, especially when compared to the events of the main series. So in order to answer this question, I've drawn up this absolutely beautiful diagram to illustrate the Targaryen lineage so we can see how the stories fit into the wider timeline. So the stories take place around the end of the reign of Daeron II and around the start of the reign of Aerys I. So you can see Daeron had several sons, and around this time, that would place it around 90 years before the events of the main series. And we can actually see how we can reach the main series by working our way down this diagram. So after Aerys becomes king, we get Maekar, and then we get Aegon V. And then you can see I've also written down Aemon over here. This is the Aemon who was at the Night's Watch, the Maester Aemon at the who we saw in the main series at the Night's Watch. And then after Aegon V, we get Jaehaerys II, and then Aerys II, the Mad King, and then we all know the Mad King gets slayed by Jaime Lannister, and then we reach Robert Baratheon. And then near the end of his reign, that's when the main series takes place. Now, at this point, if you're confused by the timeline and names and you're wondering whether it's really okay to dive into the book without reading the original novels, you don't have to worry because the novels themselves also don't explain the timeline very clearly. So people who've read the original novels don't have that much of an advantage here. And so you might be wondering how I know all of this. For that, you will have to read this, The World of Ice and Fire. This is a tie-in book to the main series, and it contains many diagrams and timelines and a brief summary of Targaryen history. But for the purposes of reading A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, a lot of the details on the timeline and all of the kings and princes get gradually fed to you throughout the story. So all I wanted to do was to just give you a clearer picture of how the story fits into the wider timeline, so you'll be more prepared to understand the story. Now, finally, on to why I think you should read this. The first reason is that these stories are very short and accessible. Each story is around 100 or so pages long, and you can probably finish a story in an afternoon. I think this is a great entry point for people who want to get a taste of George R. R. Martin's writing, which I think is definitely worth it because he's such a compelling storyteller. My suggestion is to at least start with the first story, The Hedge Knight. The Hedge Knight is a great story, and if you enjoyed it, you can move on to the second story. And if you didn't, you can just put the book down and still feel good for having finished one full story. The second reason is that the stories deepen the lore and world building. As you can see from the timeline I just showed you, this is a story that takes place within the reign of Targaryen kings, and that's already very different from the main series, where the Targaryens have already been deposed and everyone is just out for war. In these stories, you really get to feel like you're in the same fantasy world as the main series, but you're in a different time period, and that just adds depth to the whole Song of Ice and Fire universe. And the third reason is the stories are just that good. The stories are really compelling, and when I read this, I just couldn't put the book down. The first and third stories, that would be the Hedge Knight and the Mystery Knight, are the best. They have all the exciting stuff you would want from a medieval fantasy, like jousting, conspiracies, and a lot of violence. I felt like the second story, The Sworn Sword, was a little weaker because of the way it ended, but that's just me. If you really want to, I actually think it's possible to skip the second story and move on straight to the third one, because the stories are kind of self-contained and the third story doesn't really reference the second one that much. You definitely have to read the first story though, because that sets up all the characters and the setting. And so that concludes everything I want to say about this book, and I just wanted to make this video because I've been living under a rock and I've just found out literally a month ago that a show based on this book is coming out this Sunday, and so I was very pleasantly surprised to learn about that, and it just brought back many memories of reading this book. I remember hearing news about the show a long time ago, but I just treated it as an unsubstantiated rumor, because that's always the case with these things. You hear about a lot of plans for spin-offs, but in the end nothing ever materializes. So all I knew was that the House of the Dragon was being made, and I was really happy to learn that the show for this is also real, and I'll definitely be watching it when it comes out. And so yeah, thanks for making it to this point of this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.